Today I'm going to highlight an innovative effort in which multiple stakeholders came together to respond to the needs of vulnerable youth leveraging social media. I'm choosing this project in particular because it illustrates the generative potential of extending the research policy practice paradigm to emphasize the importance of community participation. We estimate that there are approximately 300 crews in New York City. Crews are fluid, geographically based groups lacking the structure and profit schemes of traditional gangs, and they're responsible for 40 to 50% of all shootings in New York City. As early as 2011, district attorneys in New York City began using social media posts and direct messages as evidence against youth charged with conspiracies related to crew violence. At the same time, organizations working with vulnerable youth in New York City and beyond began to report an increase in the number of violent conflicts that began as online interactions. Against this backdrop, we were approached by the Citizens Crime Commission of New York City, which supports the Cure Violence program in New York. Cure Violence is an evidence-based intervention for preventing violence and employs community members who are formerly gang involved to intervene and promote peace. In New York City, Cure Violence is part of an initiative called the Crisis Management System, which comprises collaborations with organizations represented by many of you in the room today, in addition to some of my co-panelists. Across the city, there are 18 Cure Violence sites working with approximately 600 youth. The Cure Violence model relies heavily on in-person intervention. It was no wonder, then, that Cure Violence staff felt inadequately prepared to intervene in virtual interactions. So, in order to get a better sense of what was needed, we went on a listening tour. Along with our partners at the Crime Commission, I spent the better part of a summer traveling to Staten Island, Harlem, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. We met with frontline workers and listened to them talk about their work, their challenges, and their successes. What emerged was a picture of kids who are doing things we want them to do in school, reading and writing, but doing them online and in ways that put them at risk for legal system involvement and death. In addition to taunts and threats, kids were also pouring their hearts out online. They were expressing sadness for the loss of loved ones and mourning friends and family who were killed. We also heard stories of how these expressions could change course and veer into revenge. It became apparent that for many of the adults working with kids, both directly and in research universities, social media represented something of an unexplored frontier. It wasn't that frontline workers or doctoral student researchers didn't have Facebook pages or Twitter accounts. Most of us did. Rather, what emerged was that social media represents a new type of context, not only for violence, but also, importantly, for prevention and intervention. Unlike school or home or neighborhood park, social media is not physically located. It co-occurs and coexists alongside all other contexts. Kids constantly engage with social media. It's also extremely public. Cure Violence prioritizes both personal communication and norm change. And when we talked to frontline workers, they spoke about an online environment in which threats and violence were the rule rather than the exception. Additionally, they shared concerns about exposing themselves and the youth they worked with, since online communications can't be truly private or erased. Whoop. In order to address these concerns and needs, we developed eResponder as a multi-pronged intervention and prevention program. I'm trained as a counseling psychologist, and one of the first things you learn as a clinician is that the best way of preventing behavior is to substitute a new one. So, in developing eResponder, we asked ourselves and our partners what types of behavior we wanted youth to increase online. eResponder has three major components: violence interruption, youth leadership, and digital citizenship. These three components are addressed through two resources, designed to be context-sensitive and strengths-based: a youth leadership curriculum and an interruption toolkit and training. We piloted the program, and our findings were promising. Working with 30 frontline staff and over 80 youth, we found that engaging with eResponder, youth demonstrated an increased ability to analyze social media content, both their own and that of others, through a critical sociostructural lens. And we found that eResponder was successful in supporting frontline staff to leverage social media as a tool to interrupt potential violence. Emphasizing the participation of community members most closely in contact with and linked to vulnerable youth allowed us to expose a previously unaddressed and understood context, bringing to bear multiple research literatures to provide solutions. In doing so, we supported frontline staff in adapting their existing strategies and skills to effectively respond. As I conclude, I would like to leave you all with 3 key takeaways. First, in doing this work, the value of close collaborations and partnerships cannot be overstated. Second, we must continuously center our work on the voices of those who are closest to the problems we seek to address. eResponder worked precisely because we listened to the frontline staff and prioritized their perspectives. And finally, media that can exacerbate problems may also contain the potential for solving them if we work together.
All right, thank you, CORIANNA. Is this on? Okay, great. As CORIANNA said, I'm Amanda Geller. I'm a clinical associate professor of sociology here at NYU. I'm going to be moderating the panel today. So I wanted to start by just talking about the broad kind of construct of juvenile justice in general, because it encompasses a lot of things. And when we talk about protecting vulnerable youth in schools, I think it's important to note that everybody on this panel works in a different domain related to criminal justice. None of us work directly in schools, but schools are a key player in what we hope to accomplish in terms of improving the well-being of young people. So when we think about juvenile justice, I think of 2 main objectives that those of us who work in this area are trying to achieve, to accomplish, to understand. One is just the diversion of young people from illegal or criminal or delinquent activity, and the other is dealing with children and kids and teens who are found to be engaged in such activities. So I am using illegal and criminal and delinquent sort of interchangeably at the moment, but one thing that is important to remember is that a lot of children wind up involved in surveillance in the juvenile justice system without actually participating in any criminal activity. I know that we're going to talk a little bit about status offenses and things like truancy, which activities that would not be criminal if done by adults, but as young people with the status of minors, they become kind of responsible for things that would not be assumed to be problematic if they were done by adults. So my own work looks at the involvement of young people with the justice system from a couple of different domains across the life course. So kids can come into contact with the system very, very early in life. I do a lot of work looking at parental incarceration and the incarceration of family members. But what I am going to focus on today is the involvement of young people themselves and their own behavior and interactions with the system. And these interactions start long before a stage of formal processing. A lot of the work that I do looks at contact with the police, which is something that cuts across neighborhood contexts, happens in schools. I know the involvement of police in schools came up a little bit this morning, and we'll talk more about that today. And a lot of these contacts with the police don't actually lead to formal processing, but they have implications for school performance, for later contacts with the system, for kids' well-being more broadly. And one thing we know is that these types of interactions with policing and the broader justice system are also incredibly racially disparate and have implications for social inequality more broadly. Most of my work in this area is based on the analysis of large data sets, both survey data and data from the police and from other administrative systems. Most of the panelists today are doing much more work directly working with young people and the systems in which they engage. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to learn from each other and to see kind of what the most productive partnerships can be going forward. So we have a really diverse, fabulous panel that I will turn it over to let everybody introduce themselves and talk about their work, and then we'll kind of engage in some Q&A.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ana Bermúdez. I'm the commissioner for the New York City Department of Probation. I've been commissioner since 2004, but I was there in 2010 as deputy commissioner for juvenile operations. My professional background has been mostly in youth work and youth involved in the justice system. A few things that you need to know about probation in the juvenile realm to sort of grapple with what we're talking about here is that probation is involved it's the second door after the arrest. So a young person gets arrested as of today under the age of 16, come October 16 with a misdemeanor charge. They come through our doors and we do a series of interviews and assessments to try to divert that case from court and not have it be formally prosecuted. We know from research over and over again, young people who are not put through the system do much better than kids who are put through the system, particularly if they exhibit low-risk behavior. And I use exhibit low behavior on purpose because there is a lot of controversy about these assessments as labeling of people, and they're not labels of people, they're assessments of behavior, not people. When people talk about, he's a high-risk individual, no, he's just behaving in a way that is of high risk, that if it continues that way, they'll continue to get rearrested because that's the kind of behavior that gets you arrested, right? So it's very important to keep that distinction. So we make a decision as to whether the case will be diverted or sent to the prosecutor's office. Has to be with the victim or the complainant in the case cannot object to that. If the victim or complainant wants access to the court, they must be able to have access to the court. Once it goes through the prosecutor's office, then they have a second cut at the case. They have diversion powers as well. And increasingly the prosecutors in family court, which is part of the law department, they divert a lot of cases. And then as of now, about 45%, they send about 45% of all arrests to prosecution. Of the cases that get sent to them. We divert about 28% of the cases, then they process. So family court, it's a funnel of arrests going down to the, to then the ones that get adjudicated. In family court today, last calendar year, probation processed about 4,500 cases intakes. When I started in 2010, we were processing 12,000 cases, and that was low already. Okay, so it's been going down. With Raise the Age, we're going to go back up in terms of processing, but our commitment is, of course, not to have the new age group fare any worse than anybody else, and we want all the kids to fare better. Then after the case gets filed in court, the legal system takes over, and then it comes back to us at probation when there's an adjudication and the judge needs to make a decision as to what kind of sentence, essentially disposition. Family court is all euphemisms, by the way. It's sentencing, but it's called disposition. And then we make a recommendation to the court based on a series of decision-making tools that we have, and then the judge sentences the youth to either probation, sent away from home to placement, within close to home, and then or something better. So that's kind of the general thing. I will do a couple flash points about education in schools. We are faced with great challenges because a lot of the young people who come to us who are supposed to be in high school are either not in high school and they're supposed to be, or are in high school and have 0 to 10 credits at a time in their lives that that really puts them behind in a trajectory to graduate from traditional schools. And then finding alternative schooling options is a nightmare. Yet judges put conditions of probation along the following lines. You must go to school all day, every day, no cuts, no unexcused absences, otherwise a violation of probation needs to be filed. And part of our position is okay, I might as well hand the violation of probation right now. When somebody hasn't been going to school, for 2 years or for a year, or is 16 and in the 8th grade. And so these are all major challenges. We're trying to resolve them through cross-collaboration, obviously, but also some internal work that we're doing with the youth.
Hi. I'm Krista Larson. I'm the director of the Center on Youth Justice at the Vera Institute of Justice, which is a New York-based research and policy institute here in Manhattan. I'm glad Anna did a lot of the heavy lifting on how the juvenile justice system works in New York, and it really does mirror how the systems look nationally. It's a little confusing. It involves lots of different players. And some of the work that we've been doing at Vera actually was the genesis of the Center on Youth Justice, is about this issue of status offenses. And I like to, although we are a fairly prestigious, if I might say, research institute, I kind of like to use the taxi driver standard for thinking about some of these issues. So when I have to travel for work and I'm at a conference or something to talk about status offenses, the taxi driver will ask me, well, why are you here? What are you doing? And I'll explain, oh, well, you know, kids who skip school can end up in locked, secure custody, and they will often say to me, well, when did we start doing that? And the answer is we've basically always done that. We have surveilled kids in schools for a very long time. I won't go down a rabbit hole of federal legislation, but there's some key points in federal legislation that have allowed us as a country to hold tight to this idea that the justice system has something to offer when systems like education or child welfare, or even when parents don't know what to do. And we're really using, I would say, based on a lot of the research that Anna described, what we hear from communities, what we hear from the kids and the families themselves, that although sometimes it's the only tool we have to solve a problem, it really is the wrong tool. And it leads to problems for kids along the way. It creates additional traumas. And yet we still remain wedded to this idea. It's the same sort of principle that leads us into all kinds of other troubles in terms of how we use our criminal justice system, but in particular for the conversation today, how we use it in relation to kids. So our work at Vera really involves us going into communities and usually that invite us, although sometimes we've been sent there by some other authority to say, help somebody, but that invite us to say, can you help us figure out how to stop locking up so many kids? Can you help us reduce the role of probation? Can you help us help the kids do a little bit better and stay out of the justice system? And the way that we do that is it really has to be a multi-agency approach, because there's an awful lot of, as I sit here between two of my primary government partners here in New York City, there's a lot of, well, we wouldn't lock them, we wouldn't file the cases if probation would just do X, or the judges will say, well, once they come to me, you know, if she's running away, I really need to be able to put her somewhere where I know that she'll be safe. And so what our approach has really been to pool all of those people in one room and try to really hold people's feet to the fire, and through a variety of means, sometimes very pleasant, sometimes more challenging, and through a mix of data and stories from kids and the expertise that is embedded in the people that make up these systems, to really find a pathway forward. One principle that we have, I think, which is really important and which we have real resources here in New York City in terms of our leadership on the juvenile justice side of things, is that very often what we see in communities is that the justice system has to be willing to say no. They have to go, and they have to go first. That schools will say, oh, you know, as long as the justice system can be that safety valve for the kids that other systems can't or won't serve, they're going to keep pushing them forward. The schools will call the cops. The schools will file those status offense petitions. Child welfare, group homes will do those same things. We will push kids into the justice system as long as the justice system is willing to say yes. So we have seen some really exciting, in my 5 seconds left, really exciting innovations, including at a legislative level where, for example, the state of Connecticut has said the issue of truancy is simply not an issue for the justice system.
Thank you. It's actually great to be here with you guys at NYU, with folks that we have actually worked together for many years at Vera and other places. And actually, today I learned that actually you work at Gouverneur as an extern, which I did many, many years ago. So in terms of the division of youth and family justice within ACS, maybe kind of from a historical perspective, what we do. ACS was created in 1996 as the first time ever having a child agency in New York City government. Within the juvenile justice side, our first entry in juvenile justice was back in 2007 with the opening of JJI, which was our first alternative to placement program in New York City in partnership with the Department of Probation. This is at the moment in time, 2007, when most kids were going to placements. There were thousands of New York City kids in OCFS upstate facilities. The city, probation, and ACS decided some of these young people don't need to be in an institution far away. They could be managed within the context of their family and the community with the right support. It kind of led to a whole bunch of other reforms that Anna and others can talk about. In 2010, New York City decided to actually move what used to be the division of the Department of Juvenile Justice, which actually had the only responsibility for managing detention within ACS. Traumatic event for many of the folks who were around in those days, but it actually changed the focus of the work in juvenile justice from being just on residential placement, pre-trial, pre-adjudication, to finally focusing on the family, which is what we strive to do at ACS every day. Big event for many of you, if you don't know it, 2012. Again, historically and almost everywhere else in the nation, young people who are adjudicated or sentenced, maybe the right term, Anna, are actually sent to facilities, usually large facilities in the state of Illinois, in the state of Connecticut still they have one, and across the city to large facilities far away from home. They look like youth prisons. In a historic moment in 2012, Anna was at probation, there was the right leadership at the state, and we decided that actually New York City kids that go through the family court should never go to an institution anymore. And that's the opening of Close to Home. So young people in New York City, those thousands of kids who used to be in the custody of the state are now less than 250 of them. They're all in New York City in places that actually we were to drive or get off the subway, you would not recognize as an institution. And that has actually make a significant difference in the work that we do. And then now we're in the midst of new legislation that Anna alluded to. In 2007, we raised the age. So as October of this year, two big things are happening. Anna alluded to the issue that 16-year-olds are going to be seen finally as kids in New York State. And also the fact that actually all the young people who are in Rikers today that are 16 and 17 will be moved out of Rikers in October of this year. So there's a lot of things happening in the juvenile justice system. In terms of numbers, again, there wasn't that long ago that many of us were dealing with thousands of kids in upstate facilities. We're talking about hundreds. In detention today, I look at the census before coming in, I only have 38 kids in New York City detention system. We have two facilities, each one of them with a capacity for 112 beds, and there's 20 kids in one of them and 18 in another one. So we have done a significant amount of work to reduce the number of kids in the system. Status offenders, which is something that we talked about. New York State, actually, with a lot of support from Vera in those days, changed some of the practices of what we call PINs, persons in need of supervision. And it's kind of a weird moment where in New York City, no one that actually has done a status offense can be put in detention. So I know that actually happens across the state, but to be clear, actually I was in Seattle a month ago, and in Washington State, you still could be a kid who doesn't go to school, and someone will go and arrest you when you go back to school and put you in detention for not having been in school. But in New York City, as of today, and it has been the case for the last 4 years, no one can be detained in any of my institutions because of a status offense. They could actually get a significant amount of resources and services from the child welfare side, but they cannot be in the juvenile justice system. There's a weird situation where actually upstate counties can still detain kids in non-secure detention as peens or status offenders, but actually that will change as of 2019.
So that's really remarkable, the decline in the kind of supervised population over time. It's really impressive. So one thing that I was hoping that each of you could comment on, since none of us works directly in the schools, but because, you know, both as a kind of source of, you know, a source of labeling when we deal with status offenses and things like that, but also as a source of support. Schools have the potential to do harm, but they also have a tremendous amount of potential to do good. And I was wondering if you guys can each comment on kind of the role that schools play in the lives of the kids that you work with, and also what kind of supports do schools need to be able to deal with disciplinary problems and things that could potentially be referred to the juvenile justice system when they're already kind of taxed with providing an education.
Yeah, we just actually, it's interesting, we actually are working in the schools at ACS. So we began a pilot about 4 months ago where actually our FAP office, our Family Assessment Program, which actually was the one designed to prevent status offenders from ever coming into the juvenile justice system, is actually working with 3 of the suspension schools to actually make services available in lieu of suspension in terms of family therapy. It's just beginning. I think we have actually served about 20 families. I don't have any data to share with anyone, but from what I hear from the folks at DOE and my staff, is really exciting in terms of the opportunity of being able to provide in-home family therapy services for a kid that otherwise may have gone to suspension. We're hoping that it works out well, and maybe some researchers here can help us evaluate it and expand it.
We don't have 5 hours, though. Okay. So I ran a school jointly with DOE a number of years ago for young people coming out of Rikers, on probation, coming out of upstate facilities at the time, et cetera. And it was supposed to be a transitional school, meaning that they came, since kids were released at all times of the year, part of the problem we were trying to solve was a kid being released from a facility mid-March. Nobody would take them into school. They'd be floundering around, waiting to maybe get into school the following September, right? So we would take the kids all times of the year. They would stay with us for about 2 semesters, or sometimes 2.5 semesters, to stabilize them, to get to know what it is that they needed, and so on and so forth, and then transition them into either a regular high school or a transfer high school or some other educational institution. Well, the more successful we became, the less they wanted to leave, right? And it all is about engagement and relationships in schools. And part of why the young people did not do well in school previously was a lot. We saw, this will not surprise you, one of the things we used to look at intake was how many distinct schools had this child been to? And of course, the more schools they had bounced around in, the worse they did in school, because they had to reset every time they started. Was about what do kids worry about? Am I going to be liked? And am I going to have friends? How am I going to get to school? Et cetera, et cetera. So you were resetting that over and over again, and you never got to the academic achievement piece of anything, right? So what schools need to do is really pay attention to kids who are bouncing around. Also, the way that we do attendance recovery or attendance improvement cannot continue to be the way we do it now, or actually, I have to give credit to DOE. DOE has been changing this a lot. We've been talking a lot. Every work group I can be in, interagency, where I can talk about education, I will. I am obsessed with this. Because it is so much, what? It's true. I know, they will say it's true. Because we're losing too many kids from the schools that we don't need to lose. There's always going to be a number of kids who may not make it in traditional schools, and then they'll get in trouble, and like, but it should be like in this hand, right? And so we need it to be not about like mom, dad, caregiver. If this kid continues not going to school, we're going to file a neglect petition in family court for educational neglect. It has to be an engagement strategy with the family. What do you need? What does the child need to learn better? What, right? A parallel process here is also how we go about assessing young people, but most of them started as kids, like little kids, of when they need specialized attention in schools with an individualized education plan, the IEP. Basically, there are two major, and one sometimes uses the occupational therapy piece, but mostly it's either you're learning disabled or emotionally disturbed. A 5-year-old can be labeled emotionally disturbed. Think about what that does to the rest of your academic career, right? What it does with us is also that once, I think there's a rate of about 11% special education rate in the city. In any juvenile justice setting you go to, Felipe's schools, a lot of, and when I look at the population of teenagers that I have, it's at least 44% of the kids have, or more have IEPs. What?
When it gets to us.
To us, right. And at least half of those have emotionally disturbed tags on them. You tell me what school's going to take a scary-looking 16-year-old with an emotionally disturbed tag on them. And then we're going to medicalize them and then, medicate them, because that's the other move. So don't even get me started with the mental health piece of this, right? So it's just, it's a cycle that we're in that we got to start breaking in some ways. I think restorative justice practices in schools goes a long way in building community and growth-based accountability, but I'll stop there.
There's an element of this that's...
It's green, but maybe put it closer. Oh, there it is.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. There's an element of this that's like getting the band back together again. We've been on panels and working together for a very long time, so Anna's right. We will say, yes, she's obsessed with this. I guess the thing that I would just add to what she just shared is that one of the things that we need to do in finding solutions is ask the kids and ask the families. We hear very different things. We adults often think we know the solutions, and of course there's a role for professional expertise and the people who actually work in these types of places, whether it's a detention center or a school. Kids, like you said, are focused on, am I going to fit in, as a precursor to whether other forms of achievement can happen. And so listening to them, the time we are most likely to listen to families too often is when they ask for detention or they ask for more restrictive things. That's when we listen as systems, and then we use that to justify our actions. So deeper listening to kids and families, I think, is what I would add.
No, there is a book actually and I have it in my office, and I have to figure out who did that and when. But there's a book called "The Schools We Want," and it's from teenagers about.
Echoing what I think has just been said, I think that it's about creating space for kids to have the conversations that they can have about the worlds that they're living in. A lot of the work that I do as someone who develops interventions is creating those opportunities. So, giving kids the vocabulary to talk about oppression, to talk about these experiences that they're having in their day-to-day lives that no one's really asking them about. And I think that can go a really far way. We know from the research that it can go a really far way in giving kids the chance that they need and deserve to flourish.
Just thinking about this for the first time, not that long ago, again, 2012, the educational outcomes were awful. And, Kim Sweet spoke before us at the educational panel, and she and many others, Legal Aid and others, were actually kind of behind a class action lawsuit that actually kind of created some movement in New York City around the young people who were coming particularly out of OCFS facilities, and that their credits were never acknowledged, and actually kind of a lack of commitment by DOE in those days. But move forward to 2012, and I think Anna, you were here in the leadership role in New York City. I was actually in the state in OCFS, but Close to Home actually was a game changer. It wasn't about an intervention. It wasn't about a new program, which we do a lot of those things. They never go to scale. It was a structural change. All of us, particularly Anna and I, have been for years trying to figure out transitional programs, better interventions, mentoring, reentry, for a kid who was far away, coming back to the education in the city from a school that I didn't have any relationship to DOE. What Close to Home did is that it told DOE, actually changed the landscape. It said, New York City kids are never going to leave New York City Department of Education. They're always going to be in the New York City Department of Education, and the New York City Department of Education is going to be accountable for them throughout their stay, no matter if they go to detention or now placement in Close to Home. That had made a significant difference. If you look at the data, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of the likelihood of kids attending to school when they come out of Close to Home to what it used to be when they were institutions, is significantly better. Can we go further? Yes, but maybe the challenge to all of us is, instead of thinking about programs, what is the structural change that needs to happen? And what we have done on the placement side is that it used to be that a kid would be placed in an institution, like a voluntary agency. You remember this, Krista? And the voluntary agency had a chance of selecting who they wanted, and they had a chance of rejecting the kid when he didn't do well. Hearing that, I was thinking, we need no eject, no reject schools that actually are going to commit to kids, are going to stick with them even when they don't do well, and they're going to bring the resources to bear when needed, right? These kids need help. But we keep on just playing pinball with kids, and we keep on throwing them out because we don't want to deal with them, and they're never going to succeed that way. So somehow, if there's any way of measuring movements, as Anna said before, and kind of making sure that instead of moving a kid, we kind of wrap around the services in one setting, I think things would be so much better.
All right. So I want to do just a quick diversion because of a conversation we were having at lunch that just highlights not only kind of the broad need for services to be provided to kids, but just the diversity of services needed. And Anna and Krista, you were talking about work that you've been doing specifically with girls and just the gender differences in needs. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. It's a bit of a jump, but it seems really important to highlight.
No, he's making it hard for me. I don't understand what's going on. Yes, we are doing, one of the things that's happening with the involvement, actually, of the people on either side of me, Vera is managing the New York City Task Force on Ending Girls' Incarceration, because so we are a city based on all of these reforms that says we don't lock kids up for things that are minor. Where it's not a threat to public safety. We really try to hold those as principles, and we have dropped, as Felipe said, we've dropped detentions and placement rates in a staggering way from 2001, when I started at Vera. The girls follow some different pathways. One of the things we've seen in the data analysis that we've done in partnership with ACS is that the girls are still entering detention mostly for misdemeanors, whereas the boys more for felonies. And so there's something there, this is the spoiler alert from the task force, is girls are different from boys. You heard it from Vera first, I guess. But so one of the things that we're doing is partnering with agencies, including ACS, including Probation, but also the Department of Ed, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the prosecutors, the mayor's office. There's a whole long list. It's really been a community-based effort where each agency is really stepping up to to look at what we've learned about the pathways that drive girls into the justice system and to figure out ways to interrupt those pathways. So we have things that are based more on improving school culture for girls, which DOE is leaning into, and they've made some really which I found incredibly heartening statements in the meetings about how, well, we've looked at some racial disparities, we've looked at some harassment stuff through a gender lens. We haven't done enough to look at the intersection of those two, and we're prepared to do that now, which I found really exciting. ACS creating new options that are going to continue to get those off-ramps, and for probation, not to speak for the commissioner, but you know, to really think about the practice and what does it mean to deliver gender-responsive practice in supervision or diversion practices for girls and for LGBT and gender non-conforming youth. Yeah, so very quickly, at probation, we're looking at a variety of, in the juvenile justice world, our current deputy commissioner has convened the Venus group, and they're looking. It's a small, you know, intra-agency work group, looking at the needs of girls, looking at, you know, our data. For example, how do they fare in terms of completing probation, in terms of detention rates or probation violations, which thankfully there's no difference between our boys and girls filing rates. And they're all going in the right direction, meaning lower, especially for technical violations of probation. We do not want to file a violation of probation that is based on a social service need or because the kid is resisting coming to appointments. They're going to do that. That's part of their job as adolescents. And so then the other piece to Krista is that girls in the justice system, where they get treated more harshly when they exhibit gender nonconforming behavior than boys, you know, for the same behavior. And so we're looking particularly at girls who come in with misdemeanor assault cases, and our ability to try to divert those cases from court in the first place, and then also managing the girls. We're going to do a pilot also in one of our boroughs to have girls-only caseloads for some probation officers to see.
I would just add, from a research perspective, I think one of the really important things that I think about a lot in the work that I do is thinking about girls as girls and not necessarily in comparison to boys, because I think frequently we get stuck in this, okay, girls are different from boys, and something like the justice system that has more boys than girls in it, you know, might cater more or be somehow structured in a way that might be better, so to speak, for boys than girls. So when we think about how are we going to meet the needs of girls, we need to think about girls as girls, not as girls compared to boys.
It's really important. Almost as many mics as people, but not quite so. We're starting to run down on time, but one thing that I want to make sure we get to is you know, everything that has come across in this panel has highlighted the importance of partnerships between you know, policymakers and practitioners and across sectors and with schools. And I was wondering if what each of you could say as practitioners about what the research community can, what kinds of questions we can be asking and how we can be integrating the realities of kind of on-the-ground practice and serving vulnerable and marginalized kids into our work.
Maybe this is less of a research question, but kind of a concern. I mean, we're at a good moment, and you know, we could always do better, but we're at a good moment where I think we have the values and the policies that really believe that actually young people thrive and do better when they're in the community. That actually is not about punishment. I mean, Anna talks about the building of skills and competencies on young people. And I think, you know, we've been around long enough, some of us, to know that that have not always been the case. So I think more and more recently, it only takes like a willy basket. It only takes like one bad case to change policy and society's perspective. And I think we need science behind, we need more science to continue to sustain the work that we're doing. More science showing that actually every one of those kids that actually Anna and I can divert from detention and goes home at night after being arrested is actually likely to do much better than the one who stays behind. We need science to show that the kid that has a credible messenger is gonna, I mean, so I think that's what we need the most, or at least that's what I'm thinking about the most recently, because we need to sustain what we have, and we need to make sure that policy is not driven by exception, which happens too many times. And you guys are perfectly suited to help us do that, or prevent that.
I've just had a conversation recently with some researchers, and one of the challenges that we have, I think, is that how the justice system or interventions in the justice system end up getting measured, right? It's always recidivism of some kind, and God knows there's 17,000 different definitions of what recidivism is. So, and what does that mean in any way? You know, we're dealing with human behavior, right? Ultimately. And so we've been trying to go to more of a wellness lens in probation, and then kind of stuck with like, and how are we going to measure that? And when people ask us, well, is this initiative effective? We want to create a definition of effectiveness that is also related to wellness or preparedness, or, you know, in our view, I can't guarantee a kid will get a job, but I can definitely have under my control whether a kid is prepared to be able to hold down a job eventually, that they have an aspiration to a career, that they, all those things, but we don't really know how to measure that, right? The other piece is that I think it's important, and this would be more like a joint advocacy to funders and whatever, the couple of times that we've started a new initiative and we've had both a process evaluation and then an outcome evaluation, that's very helpful, because then the researcher is embedded in the whole process, and we can learn as we're going, you know, and we can course correct as it's going, and then it's not this all or nothing outcome evaluation at the end that has this kind of, you know, whatever. So those have been just a couple of.
Well, I'm in an interesting place because I work at a research institute. So I can tell you a little bit about what we've been actually doing and where we see a gap in the field, which is about this concept of what we're calling collaborative research, which is related to participatory action research, where the people that you're interested in also become the co-designers and the co-analysts of the data that you're collecting. So one example that we're doing right now is in our, we're doing some work on transforming conditions of corrections for young adults. And we started in Connecticut, and the way that we started was with surveying the entire young adult population, as well as the corrections officers, to ask what was wrong, what needed to happen, what needed to change. And then not only did we get that data, sit in Manhattan and look at it, but we took it, put it up on posters, went back to those same groups and asked them what it meant. And so the answers that we derived from that fed into the design of the study, and now we're going back every it might not be every 3 months now, it might be 6, every few months or so, to another survey and then another data processing session with those groups to make sure that their perspectives, the people who are closest, the people who are living and working in those prisons, are informing both the design of the innovation, but also the research that's studying it.
Just a question to the audience, because you open up with the work with Stephanie Uberdahl and Citizens Crime Commission. I think we need more of that kind of technology-driven way of connecting to kids. And I mean, like, both of us are always trying to figure out how well are we doing on behalf of kids. I think that's the way to do it, but we haven't figured it out.
I can say something about that. Yeah, I think that for me, it's what I'm hearing from all of you, and what I think about in terms of research is we need to think about not only what we don't want, but also what we do want. And we need to, again, listen to the kids and go to the kids where they are. And that's what the kind of one of the key insights was from that work that we did with the Citizens Crime Commission. It was that, you know, kids are online all the time and they're engaging with social media in an entirely different way than I do as a 32-year-old, and really meeting them where they are and listening to them.